This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome into Rhode Island's podcast of record, B-Town. It's Bill Bartholomew here with you, as I am for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday, and of course anytime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or ripodcast.com. You may also find me on social media at Bill Bartholomew on Twitter and Instagram, and inside the Bartholomew Town Podcast Facebook group, where we have a daily discussion on all that's happening here in the Ocean State. Today, we welcome back to the program Senator Tiara Mack for her first appearance as an elected official. I think she was last on right after winning the Democratic primary over Harold Metz back in September. Now, Tiara Mack, someone who came out of that Rhode Island political co-op, sort of new wave of energy into Rhode Island politics, and having landed in the Senate, now sort of part of the body politique, if you will, here in Rhode Island, sort of understanding the mechanics of how ideas become actual legislation and eventually are implemented into all of our lives here in the Ocean State. So we get into that today. I also wonder, is Tiara Mack a name that you might hear when people start speculating about, I don't know, gubernatorial candidates or Congress candidates, federal senatorial candidates? I mean, who knows, right? If there's one thing we learned from this past September's Democratic primary and that new wave of energy that I just spoke of, it's in large part, of course, speaking to those who are traditional voters who have been voting and engaged in politics at one level or another, either on a very basic level, hey, it's a week before an election, let me find out who the candidates are, compare and contrast, look at some of the issues, so on and so forth. And also those who are kind of part of that inside baseball, the bubble, so to speak, of Rhode Island politics. But also, there are new voters, there are people who weren't engaged in the process who are coming on board now, either in terms of their age or other disposition that they were outside of the political process, and they're now coming on board. And I like to think we reach some of you here on B-Town, you know what I mean? Really, that everything from the inside baseball, the bubble of Rhode Island politics, all the way out to people who have just a baseline curiosity. But we learned in September that curiosity is turning into action. And I think as time moves along here, 2022, 2024, so on and so forth, we're going to start to see more new voters turn out and express those ideals and perspectives and looking for candidates that they identify with. So Rhode Island politics, man, it's always something, and I think it's really heading in a direction now where it's going to be more exciting, more all-encompassing, and more engaging than it has been, I don't know, maybe back to ever.
A safe, affordable place to call home is the American dream. But too many Rhode Island families, seniors, and veterans are struggling to find a home or apartment they can afford, especially during the COVID pandemic. You can help change that by voting yes on question 3 to invest $65 million in the construction and preservation of affordable homes and apartments across Rhode Island. Vote yes on 3 for homes, for jobs, for Rhode Island. Learn more at yeson3ri.com. Paid for by Yes on 3.
So what's it like now? Because you spend so much time as a candidate, as sort of a rock star candidate. I mean, frankly, you were getting a lot of national press, and one of the leading voices, one of the leading new voices that entered in the Democratic primary in September, and obviously into the General Assembly at large. But now what's it like? You're actually sworn into office. How has your life changed?
Weird. And a lot of it's still happening from my home and in pajama bottoms.
Yeah. I wonder how long that's going to last for. It's kind of, obviously COVID as a whole is a horrendous thing, but the sort of decision-making from home isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity.
No, I think it's also made, it's made the transition much smoother, and it's really grounded me. I can sit and be under a weighted blanket, or I can be in my pajama bottoms. And I can really have a lot of the comforts. The State House, as we know, is a very inaccessible building for people who look like me, and for people who are not used to being involved in quote unquote politics. So it makes it that much easier to do it, to go to a committee hearing or to testify from the comfort of your home and through your cell phone.
Yeah. And what's interesting, it's obviously there's multiple layers to what you just said there. There's the obvious layer, but then there's also the notion of outsiders, you know what I mean? And anybody who's not part of this country club, regardless of demographics, that's also frankly exclusionary. Even me, in the last few weeks, I've been catching a lot of grief from certain actors and like the right-wing media. And when it started to happen, I started to think, certain members of the quote unquote far right media, but I started to think, man, it must have been so like annoying for you when you were kind of getting barraged as well, for lack of a better term. Because I mean, it's sort of hurtful, but it's also goes to the business, but it's more like, this is so annoying. Why can't people just assess my decisions, my policies, my ideas? And instead they create these labels. What's that like?
Yeah, it's been, I think that's probably been the hardest adjustment. There is a microscope in front of my life now. And I just turned 27. And so it's really weird to have such a public life and a private life. And being an openly queer Black woman, being a young, quote unquote, radical, progressive, liberal, all the titles that they give you. And very few people take the time to actually ask, how does a formerly low income Black queer person internalize policy and messages and systems that are inherently stacked up against them? A lot of people just put me in the liberal label. They put me in that radical bubble, and they don't ask about the people-informed and the experience-formed policy that is critical to the work and the culture shift that I'm hoping to do at the State House.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, I had Speaker Shikarchi on, and obviously on the House side versus the Senate side. But, I asked him, and he said it was the first time anyone's asked him. I said, how much does, the notion that someone is progressive, old guard Democrat, moderate conservative, far right, et cetera, really matter at the end of the day when you're trying to formulate policy? Obviously, it impacts the policies you want to put forth. But in terms of like the human to human interaction, the collaboration of getting ideas on the table. And he was surprised because he was like, wow, no one really asked me that. They usually drift to, okay, we got Mike Chippendale over here. And then over here, we've got, whoever, Dawn Oyer in the Senate side, whatever it is. At the end of the day, to legislate is really just about ideas, and politics, that is more about getting elected and being true to your values. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I also was a little bit afraid to kind of go into the Senate chamber as like a young, labeled progressive, Democrat, radical, all the things that the media has said. And I was like, oh, am I going to have any like friends besides my co-op people? What's it going to be like to collaborate with people whose narrative and who I've only seen from the outside is the antithesis or just fundamentally different than mine? And I've been pleasantly surprised with the amount of conversations that I've been able to have in the 1.5 hour long sessions that we have once a week with my colleagues. But yeah, I think that's the most important part. And that is also part of changing the culture. We are, and by we, I mean the new wave of young, progressive, Black, brown, formerly low income, queer voices are coming into this office and saying that the narrative for too long has been exclusionary. And if we want to practice radical inclusivity, that means our voices are heard just as much as your voices are heard. So we can't shut out those other conversations because they're important. And we've got to keep the narrative going and the dialogue going if we want to have people-informed policy.
You must have inspired a lot of people to run for office, you and the entire group of people that entered into politics this year in Rhode Island in various levels. I mean, even at the municipal level, even behind the scenes, there are people who I would assume you've heard from people that have said, wow, you know what? I never really thought of myself as involved in politics, besides maybe on an activist level. But as far as getting into elected legislative governance roles, have you heard from people out there who have been shut out of the process that said, you know what, you guys, this is such a lame term, but the glass ceiling has been broken, so to speak, and there's an opportunity that was not really there before?
Yeah, no, I've heard it from a bunch of people actually. And I think that's also one of the weirdest things is like, people are like, oh my God, your story's so inspirational. You're just such an inspiration, or like, I'm so motivated by your story. I want to get involved and I want to get involved politically. I want to find organizations that align with my values. I want to find people and I want to find ways to fight back against the system. And it's both an honor and it's also kind of scary. I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. Don't follow me. I'm lost. But I think that's also another part of changing the narrative. You don't have to have all the right answers in order to be someone who is going to use your experience as your expertise. And I think that's one of the most important things that I have to remind myself. My experience as a formerly low income Black queer woman is the only expertise and the only narrative I need to be an expert on in order to have a voice and a narrative at the State House that is going to cause a culture shift. Yeah.
What about issues that are near and dear to your heart that have been perceived as impossible or not physically or fiscally possible in modern times? I mean, for example, we're seeing $11.10 proposed by Raptakis and others for a minimum wage. Mm-hmm. And, I look at that and I'm like, wow, I always go back here, I guess ostensibly I'm a small business. I'm just a one person operation doing my podcast, but yeah, it'd be awesome to have a staff of people doing social media or whatever, but I would never do that if I couldn't pay them $20 an hour, $25 an hour. You just got to take on more work. So I hear that small business argument and I'm like, just tough it out. I mean, yeah, you can't crash small businesses by burdening them with unfair or onerous taxes that make them non-competitive. But at the same time, when it comes to workers, if you can't pay people a living wage, why have that worker then? Just do it yourself.
Yeah. I think that's also one of the hardest conversations to have with people. Talking about salary is one of those taboo subjects. You're not supposed to talk about money, politics, or sex at the dinner table. Yeah. And so talking about what it's like to be raised by someone who worked a minimum wage job most of their life and also had to provide for 5 children. That means rent wasn't paid. That means there was lights that were cut off. There was internet that was cut off. And there were certain quote unquote luxuries like food and shelter and clothing that my family didn't have access to. And so I think when we talk about what a living wage is, we can't just talk about a minimum salary, what people quote unquote deserve, because there is more than enough. I think oftentimes the narrative has been like, well, there isn't enough money. If we did that, small business would close. But we have businesses where CEOs are making more than 100 times their lowest paid workers. We have a system that is set up to make sure that CEOs and top executives are able to make more than a living wage while their workers are doing the vast majority of their labor and aren't able to pay rent, aren't able to afford food, and aren't able to afford some of the basic necessities in life. And so I think once we start centering the conversation about there is an abundance of resources in our communities, we do not have a deficit of money, of resources. We just need to make sure that we have stronger systems to make sure the resources are being distributed equitably amongst every single person in our state.
Have you been able to win over anybody who's been skeptical of that and bring them into your way of thinking? People who are even labeled Democrat who say, hey, look, I like this on paper, but there's too many small businesses in the state that couldn't afford to pay $15 or more per hour. So I have to then propose something like $11.10 per hour. Have you been able to get anybody to say, oh, you know what? From an economic theory standpoint, it makes more sense to have people being able to pay their bills and live their life without having, the world fall out from under them. Has anybody said that?
No, unfortunately. I think it's such a longer conversation.
Yeah.
You have to really change a lot of people's fundamental and core beliefs about what it means to be able to be productive under capitalism, which is a whole other conversation. Yeah. It's also unpacking a lot of white supremacist narratives, which is a whole other conversation with folks like who is deserving of labor. We have to have conversations about ability, about race, about disability, about justice. And so it's much more than giving people a living and just wage. It's about undoing a lot of the foundational narratives that tell people that certain people do not deserve to have the basic necessities that they need in life. And maybe they don't think that way, but at the core of their foundational thinking, that is what it's predicated on. And a lot of people are afraid to have big conversations. I've had to really remind myself that I can't water down any message just because it makes people more comfortable. There's actually a sex ed policy that I was surprised at how many folks were hesitant to say, like, yeah, I'll sign on to that because I had the word pleasure inside of it. And they're like, well, if we just just took out the word pleasure, it would be that much more digestible and it'll probably pass more likely than if we like took it out. And like, well, my core belief is that if adults and lawmakers cannot talk about masturbation and pleasure, how in the world can we expect our young people to have productive and healthy conversations about their body and their autonomy? We can't do that. So I can't remove this word and stay true to the fact that we need to have at every intersection a tough conversation and uncomfortable conversations if we want to move the needle on what is culturally appropriate and what's culturally relevant at the state house. And it starts with words like pleasure, and it starts with words like, or starts with ideas like a $20 minimum salary.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if like Cotton Mather or some other like puritanical figure is still in charge of things. You know what I mean? We get so caught up in I don't know where it comes from. I guess it comes from spiritual sectors to a certain extent. I guess it comes from old time sectors, but yeah, people are afraid to have those conversations. And what's fascinating is if you look at the Zoomers, Gen Z, and even are you a millennial? Would you technically?
I am a millennial.
Yeah. Okay. So we're both millennials. So even our generation, really pushing boundaries of saying to whether it's educators, other, parents, whatever, saying, hey, look, we're at a point now in society in the timeline where we're going to go ahead and be ourselves. And if you want to catch up to us, we're seeing more and more of that. Now, there's obviously a lot of repression and there's things that still hold people back. But the culture from the bottom up, for lack of a better term, is shifting. So it's surprising to me that more legislators, more people in the senior, not age, but in decision-making capacities aren't willing to catch up to that by and large.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain element of fear. Changing culture and shifting narratives is hard work. A lot of people are afraid to do things that is the antithesis of what they've been told is possible. And I think that's why there's a lot of fear and a lot of hesitancy around the quote unquote progressives. I don't really see myself as a progressive, mostly because I think the other side uses it as a dirty word, and I don't want to ascribe to that narrative. But I think it's really hard for people to see a system work in ways that they have never seen it work before. And that is even in the form of having Black women in office, in the form of having Black queer women in office, in the form of having young Black queer women in office. When I was on the doors and stating my identities and saying, the first thing that came out of my mouth is, my name is Tiara Mack and I am a formerly low-income Black queer woman. And I had people question, why does that matter? Why does that matter? It's because when you think about a politician, you don't immediately jump to a young, low-income Black woman who identifies strongly as queer. And so we're breaking down the narratives, even on the subversive level. What do people think about when they think about politics? And I think there's just some hesitancy. Some people it's really hard to change what you've grown up believing is true and right. And so when someone comes along and says, hey, a better world is possible, a different world is possible, it kind of shakes up your foundation. You're like, oh, well, but this has been working. At least I thought it was.
Yeah. And that's how you knocked off former Senator Harold Metz, was by explaining, hey, look, things haven't been working for everybody, and you may not know that, but here's where the problem areas are, and you were able to get enough people. And by the way, you crushed Senator Metz in that primary. Yeah. So it's interesting. It shows that I think a lot of times people assume, well, like you say, progressives, and I also, that term is so overused. And I once had a debate with Matt Allen. I was like, there are conservative people who you could argue are progressive because they're moving towards a more just and equitable society. They still may have things that are fundamentally someone may disagree with, but they're progressive in their thought process, maybe because of their social justice positions or their social issues positions. And being progressive is not necessarily on the political spectrum. It's just moving. It's like a triangular thing. It's just moving towards justice and moving past the burdens that have been placed upon large segments of our society for so long. It's less of like the far left liberal, hyper liberal, cult or whatever.
Socialists or whatever.
It's really an overused and underwhelming narrative at this point, I take you inside breaking news and the biggest stories of the day impacting Rhode Island on Instagram at Bartholomew Town, Twitter at Bill Bartholomew, and inside the Bartholomew Town podcast Facebook group. What about, so you have great chops, like you're really strong. I've seen you out there campaigning. I've seen you like on election day interacting with people. You're great on the mic. You're a strong interview. You know, you have
Thank you.
People rallying around you. Are you committed to Rhode Island, and do you see yourself running for higher office? I know you're like a month into your first senatorial term, but you know what I mean? You can sort of ID it early on. Your name doesn't come up. People say, oh, here's the gubernatorial candidates for the next 20 years. You know, it's going to be Seth Magaziner, and then it's going to be this and that. But your name hasn't come up. Do you want something like that? Should you be mentioned?
That's such a scary question. I mean, I never honestly saw myself as a state senator at 27. And I think that, one, I am a Sagittarius fire sign, so I really trust the journey.
Yeah.
I love the journey of the adventure, and I think I've never said no to an opportunity. But I think that's also part of the conversation that we have to shift. A lot of people come into this office and they use it as a stepping stone. And that was one of the things that I really struggled with on the doors, is how do I explain to people that the change that I want doesn't have to start with me as a city council member. It doesn't have to start with me being in the city council, then becoming mayor, then becoming a state senator, then going into becoming like the senator or congressperson or mayor. The change that I want means that we are taking what it means to lead from a position of storytelling and from historically and systemically marginalized identities, and putting those voices in power. And if that means that my voice right now is the voice that people need in order to feel empowered, in order to shift the narrative, then that's what that is where I'm at. And then down the line, maybe it doesn't look like me. Maybe there are more bold and forward thinking and people inclusive leaders inside of the state of Rhode Island. I'm super committed to seeing a Rhode Island that works for literally everyone, whether that looks like me staying in this position for 10 years, me moving up into a different position in the next 5. But I think I'm just going to trust the journey, which is kind of a cop-out to say the least. But
hey, I like that answer. You know what I mean? Just follow the stars wherever they take you. There's really no point in speculating. What about the media in Rhode Island? You know, it's really interesting. Some people see the media as like dominated by big box media, and then obviously we have the sort of independent media outlets that are out there as well. But there's a lot of great human beings inside the quote unquote big box media. But do you think the narrative gets lost as a result of the fact that so many people get their news and information from, I don't know, the bigger not networks, but the bigger stations? Or like, what's that like?
Yeah. It's so funny. So I had to, as a practice, make sure that during the summer when I was campaigning, I had an intern and friends who would check my social media before I did, because sometimes when there was a big news article in the state, I would have troll upon troll scouring through my social media for anything to say, like, how is this classy? You're disgusting. Like, this isn't what it looks like to be a leader. I can't believe this is the face of XYZ. And so it's kind of funny how, like, I can tell when my name has been in one of those like big box media things, because my Facebook blows up. I get more messages. I get more Instagram posts. I have like more people commenting on my Instagram. So, but I think it's really hard. Rhode Island seems like such a small state, and it is such a small state, but there's so many different pockets and so many different communities. And a lot of people are like, oh, this is someone who's accessible. Like, why this person? Or like, I don't personally know her, so she must not be doing all the great things that are happening in my small insular bubble. And so I think that's one of the things about like the big box. It makes everything seem so much smaller and so much more insular. Like, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter so easily, and feel like you can just like send me a DM, mostly because I do check my DMs and my private messages. So it seems that much more accessible, and like, we're just like regular people. We're so much more far removed from in a larger state, like the politicians who their full-time job is to legislate, where my full-time job is as a youth organizer, and I legislate as a part-time / full-time side gig.
Yeah. What about keeping Rhode Island's about to lose a congressperson? We're declining population. We always hear that, oh, it's because of the infrastructure or the corruption or the taxes or this or that. But from your perspective, what is it going to take to keep Rhode Islanders in Rhode Island, and even more so, attract people to the state that can generate new ideas for whether you're talking about the green or blue economy, whether you're talking about industries of the future. And how do you build that platform upon, especially coming out of the damage that we're going to have as a result of the COVID shutdowns?
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important time for us to really think about what do we want the next 10, 20 years to look like, and we have to start now. And that's why we have this bold Green New Deal policy that is going to bring green, new, just jobs to every single community. It's going to create new union jobs. It's going to create new industry. It's going to make sure that every single person in our state has access to affordable, clean housing. And I think those are like the quote unquote bold, radical conversations about what the future looks like. But how do we get an industry right here in the Ocean State that capitalizes on all the natural resources that we have, the natural talent? Rhode Island is the only city state in the country. We can capitalize on what it's like to be a city state where you can go to the beach, the rural parts of our state within 45 minutes and have a completely different experience. If we can connect via more robust bus lines, if we can connect through speed trains, if we can connect the greater Northeast corridor through transportation and trains, and if we can attract some of the best and brightest minds. We have an Ivy League university, we have Johnson and Wales University, we have PC. What are we doing to keep and attract that talent right here in our state to make sure that we're building a society and infrastructure where people and the best minds are thinking and creating that future society in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think the trains, I mean, that is something that is shocking to me, that we don't have a robust train system to get to New York, Boston, DC, and the fact that it's so expensive to take the train, or you have to play the games of like, all right, I'm going to drive to Kingston, take it to like New London, then go from New London to New Haven, then shift trains New Haven to New York, get on the subway. It's like, if we just had that robust economic driver of a train throughout the Northeast corridor, I feel like we would be able to be, even without residents in Rhode Island, we would be able to pump ideas, dollars, and consistency into the state. But it's just one of those things that doesn't make it to the cutting floor. It gets left on the cutting room floor when policy is made.
Yeah, and it's such a shame because, I mean, I love Rhode Island. I love living in Providence, and I grew up just north of Atlanta, and I lived in the South, and I've never felt a city or been a part of a city that just has so many moving parts and that you can experience so many different things within a single day. Like you can go to the beach, go to downtown. Well, pre-COVID, you could do all these things and have a great dining experience. Some of the best restaurants I've ever been to are right here in Rhode Island. And as a big foodie, we have such a great food experience. If we could capitalize on what it's like to attract people to Providence for larger conferences and for gatherings for corporate, not just Boston. Like, who wants to go to Boston? Why not come to Providence? It's that cute little town that you see in Wes Anderson movies with all the colors. Why not go there?
Yeah, I completely agree. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the I-195 land and how Providence, there's a lot of ideas about co-working downtown right now. There's a lot of ideas about attracting blue economy businesses. I mean, we're seeing the wind farms, which, you know, you can go back and forth on that for forever. But the thought of it being a hub, Providence being a hub, frankly, Newport being a hub. Newport is also an amazing city. It's a diverse city, and they're making a lot of mistakes there right now with the Airbnb overpopulation and with the decisions they're making on the north end, how they're really cutting the city in half from those who are in the more affordable portions of it. We need to connect people and ideas here in Rhode Island so we can interact and attract a robust and dynamic economy. I mean, this isn't like La La Land, kumbaya. This is like practical. It will be better if everyone's interconnected and our ideas are shared and accepted.
And even connecting us with Southeast Mass. I taught in New Bedford, and that is an amazing city. It's got a robust history, and it's a lot of people. I can't speak from experience, but a lot of people say that New Bedford's what Providence used to be 20 years ago, and it's like one of those up and coming cities. And imagine if we were connected to Boston. Why does it take 50 minutes to drive to Boston and the same 50 minutes to take the train to Boston? there's just so many questions. I'm like, that makes no sense.
Yeah, we got to move forward. All right, last couple of minutes. Dan McKee, Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee. Look, he's somebody that I've known for a couple of years now. He was the first guest on Bartholomew Town 272 episodes ago, or whatever it was, 274. And I've followed him closely. Look, he's a moderate. There's positions he has that are conservative. He's pro-charter school. There's a lot of things that will be looked at and holes that will be poked by people who are on the left, I would assume, or even on the right to a certain extent. But do you get the sense that he is going to take a more down-to-earth, bottom-up approach than Governor Raimondo? And do you feel like there's going to be a good working relationship between the Senate and also, for lack of a better term, the Rhode Island political co-op, the new candidates that have entered? Do you feel like you've got an opportunity to work with the incoming governor?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've seen some of the names that have been listed on his transition team and some of the organizations that have been called in to be part of that transition team. And I can only hope that in the middle of a global pandemic, in the middle of a governor transition, in the middle of a term, that this is someone who's really going to listen to the needs of every single person. There are so many voices that are in the room, the metaphorical room, that are wanting the best for Rhode Island. We need to have not just new, bold ideas. We need to have new, bold, people-centered ideas that aren't just about stimulating our economy, but that are about stimulating and encouraging justice in every single aspect. That includes having more Black voices, having more queer voices, having more Latinx voices, and really listening to what the activists are saying. There's a lot of hard conversations on the table. We have a school system in Providence that is collapsing. We have a proposed charter moratorium that, on one side, there are Black and brown families that want more charter schools. And on the other side, there are more Black and brown families that don't want charter schools. These are highly nuanced conversations. And as a leader, you're going to have to make really hard decisions. And I think it's going to be having a team of people who are committed to this idea that justice and liberation needs to be at the center of all decisions. We can't politic around as usual. That just won't fly. We are 11 months into a global pandemic. We need to have brave, bold, new thinkers who are really going to put people, experiences, and stories at the front of their leadership. And I hope, as someone who's coming in kind of with a clean slate, that he's really going to center stories and narratives of directly impacted people. And I hope that we just encourage you to do that. I will always speak my mind and be loud. I think I've kind of like set that up as like a basis of who Tiara Mack is going to be as a senator.
Yeah, par for the course.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think back to the McKee campaign in 2018. I monitored that McKee-Regenberg race super closely, kind of, I don't want to say follow them around. It's not like I had night vision goggles and I was crawling through like the woods of Cumberland or something. But, I was at a lot of events that they were both at, either together or separately. I watched them campaign. And Dan McKee is somebody that did get into and knew players inside communities that were deep in the heart of areas that I think people don't assume he was. In other words, I saw him in my neighborhood here in South Providence. I saw him in Central Falls on the ground, and he knows players in the game there. Now, does that turn into policy decision making? I'm not sure, but at least that he's had boots on the ground, and it didn't seem to be just for political reasons. I mean, I think his experience as an AAU basketball coach, where you're traveling around the state, coaching against kids in every neighborhood in the state, I think that maybe played into his fundamental understanding of the nuances of the state. And I hope that that's reflected in his governorship. Yeah. It'll be interesting. All right.
Yeah, no, I've only heard good things. Oh yeah. I've only heard
go
good
ahead.
things
Yeah,
about
please.
People
Yep.
who know experience. And so I'm hopeful that also, it's so interesting when you talk about the places that people know, but it's not just these political insiders, it's regular schmegular people.
Yeah.
And I think that also has the potential to impact what type of policy and what type of movement we can see in the state. So it's not someone who's thinking top down, it's someone who's thinking grassroots up.
Yeah. All right. Last question. I see the image behind you on your wall. You have a rabbit.
I do. I do.
What's that like? I've always wondered, my dream would be to be like able to rehab like an owl or a beaver or whatever, like, and then release it. I used to like rehab turtles when I grew up in the woods, and then my mom would always make me release them into the pond at the end of the summer, that whole thing. But having a rabbit is sort of like you get to keep the animal forever. And what's that relationship like?
It's so funny. Rabbits are like a very strange and funny mix of like cat and dog. They have their own personalities. They're super sassy. My rabbit, Moonlight Mahershala, he is the sassiest little thing. He will ignore me. He will stomp his feet at me. He will nip at me, and then he will also cuddle. And it's I think especially during quarantine, it's been a really big joy to have him. He like has his foods that he likes. He has his fruits that he likes. He like every morning runs to my door and it's just like, Mom, come out, come out, come out. So I think it's really fun to have a little rabbit around, and they're just a really like fun and personable type of animal. They require a lot more care than people realize, but my rabbit is 9 years old, almost going on 10 next month. So they also stay, or they live a really long time if you take care of them.
Does he hop around your house, your apartment, or does he live in an enclosure or something like that?
Oh, he is fully cage free. When I first adopted him about almost 5 years ago now, he was adamant about not being in a cage. And I grew up with rabbits. My family always had cage rabbits. We would let out when we were home, and I grew up with a lot of siblings, so there was always someone to watch the rabbit while it was like roaming around the home. But Moonlight is fully cage free. He is litter box trained. He eats organic greens and organic bananas. So he's a very particular little bun, but he enjoys a lot of freedoms around the house.
That's awesome. I wonder, is there a General Assembly pet day? I feel like I vaguely remember seeing this happen. Maybe it was a weird.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Like I'd love to see a rabbit on the floor.
Yeah, I have a little leash for him, and I have a little carrier. And so I was walking him like during the summer, and someone's like, "Is that a dog?" And I'm like, "No, it's a rabbit."
Nope.
And you're like, "What? I've never seen that."
Senator Tiara Mack, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, thanks so much for hopping on. And
thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'll see you up at the vets at some point. Or you're not at the vets. You're at Rick, right?
Yep, we're at Rick.
What's that like? Has that been weird?
Oh, it's so weird. Everything's weird and strange, and we're only up there once a week, but everyone keeps saying, like, well, in normal times, this is how this would work, or in normal times, this is how this would work. And I'm like, well, nothing's normal, and I don't know how anything works. So just kind of like making up new rules, which I think is, for a rule breaker like me and someone who's a counterculture, I think it's really nice to have all the rules kind of not be in place. You can make new runs and establish new quote unquote normal.
Rhode Island's podcast of record, B-Town.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.